All right. Well, I want to begin by officially thanking you all for being part of this series on racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. As we've seen during our time together, much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our country's history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or hold ourselves are a direct consequence of intentional public and economic policy and cultural beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. Now that we more deeply understand the history of our country and the myriad ways that bigotry and discrimination are embedded in our society, we turn our attention this evening to the question, so what are we going to do about it? We have seen much about our country's history in these weeks together that cry out for action, for reform. Much of the historic economic discrimination will take decades or longer to address in comprehensive ways. But we here and others have it within our ability to take meaningful action on issues of criminal justice reform and voting rights, alleviating poverty and addressing inequity in our education systems. It's essential that we do that so that we make our voices heard, so that theirs may be heard as well. And there's another aspect of action that is less concrete, but equally important, one that addresses our personal beliefs that are based on our individual histories, our families, our education, our experiences. Examining those beliefs, surfacing what is called unconscious bias or implicit bias, is an important step in our ability to identify and counter racism in its many manifestations. Our class this evening will take what we've learned and use it as a catalyst for action. I have some thoughts to share with you as we begin, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives as we engage in a meaningful path forward to a more just and equitable society. Together, we will look ahead to use our deeper understanding of our country's history to shape our future actions as we indeed seek justice and peace for all. So we begin, as always, with a brief recap of last week's class, the topic being voter suppression then and now. We reviewed the legal history of voting rights in our country, actually beginning with the Declaration of Independence. We spent a fair amount of time on the 14th and 15th Amendments and the end of Reconstruction. The end of that period ushered in 100 years of voter suppression tactics that intensified with time, impacting virtually all African Americans in our country, not just those in the South. And that 100 years came to a turning point in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But what we know is that in 2013, the Supreme Court decision in Shelby v. Holder gutted that powerful law that had so expanded enfranchisement of African American voters in our country. And that led to an accelerating time predicated on a myth of voter fraud, of laws regarding voter IDs, voter roll purges, limitation of resources for minority voting areas. And we know that since the elections of 2020, 2022, and 2024, the assault is accelerating. And so we asked the question at the end of last week's class, if indeed, as Thomas Jefferson said, the authority of government rests on receiving the consent of the governed, which we give through our vote. If that's where the legitimacy derives, then what is the role of government? Is it to facilitate voting or to constrain it? And is voting a right or a privilege? And who gets to say? And we would hope as we move toward the future, we know that in any number of states, action is being taken to expand the voting base. And we need to be aware of those initiatives and support them wherever we can. Or conversely, if we're seeing legislation that would constrain voting, to speak out against it. So we're looking back at a 6-week period. Our first class was the early years from 1619 to 1865. Class number 2 was slavery by another name. It focused on the period of Reconstruction following the Civil War, a period about which many of us learned relatively little about the realities of that period. We heard about carpetbaggers. We heard about carpetbag misrule. Somehow the end of Reconstruction was celebrated, when indeed it had been a ray of hope for a more perfect union following the end of the war. We saw how Black codes, laws that targeted Black people were passed, and that led to convict leasing and racially focused public chain gangs, and ushered in the period known as Jim Crow segregation, which was enforced by horrific violence. Week 3, we moved into the 20th century and looked at public policy such as the Federal Housing Administration, Social Security Act, the GI Bill, even the interstate highway system, and the ways in which those were manipulated to be discriminatory. Class 4, we spent our time on the criminal justice system, particularly from the period of 1970 on, called mass incarceration and the war on drugs. And we learned that while the United States is home to 5% of the world's population, we indeed hold 25% of the world's prisoners. And of course, last week, voter suppression. And so the question before us tonight is, where do we go from here? And I'm going to revisit a few definitions that we covered in our very first class, that prejudice is an unfavorable opinion and formed often without personal knowledge. What surfaces when those prejudices are in place are stereotypes. We don't know a particular person or group of people, and so what rushes in to fill the void is what people say, what we've heard. And we'll talk more about that tonight. White supremacy is intentional, it is punitive, and it is, in fact, the default in the United States of America. It is the belief that white people are inherently superior to people from all other racial groups, especially Black people, and are therefore rightfully the dominant group in any society. And so as we hear all of this focus on DEI, DEI is the antithesis of white supremacy, if you will, but where you have a system that says white people are rightfully and appropriately, by virtue of their capabilities, the dominant group in any society, then DEI, by definition, becomes an attempt to support and move forward people who don't deserve it. Racism is discrimination directed against a group of people. And it is not just racist comments, it is a system, indeed, a system of prejudice plus power. We asked the question in our first class, can Black people be racist? And I believe the answer is Black people can hate white people, they can be antagonistic toward Black people, they can resent white people, but there is no system of power that enables Black people to exert their will over a group of white people by virtue of their race. That's reserved for those of us who are white, for that system. So this evening, we'll shift our attention from our history to our future and use our deeper understanding of our past to shape our future actions. And so I would ask, as we reflect back on this time together, what have we learned? How are we affected by what we now know? And how are we different, perhaps? What do we see differently? If we can now see a pattern of white supremacy, of discrimination, what do we need to do about it, individually, collectively? And might we, understanding the depths and the origins of our system, feel a new or a renewed urgency to act, to make a difference? So what have we learned? We learned that the institution of slavery created and sustained an underclass of people from shortly after 1619 through 1865, at which point the institution ended, but the belief in Black inferiority did not. We know that in order to own Black people as property, there had to be a view of them as somehow less than, and that Black inferiority as a belief, as an attitude, persisted long after the institution itself disappeared. The dean talked about an experience just this week with a neighbor that reflects that view. We saw how segregation as law until 1964, 100 years after the end of the Civil War, embodied and perpetuated white supremacy. And the legacy of that remains, particularly residential segregation, where we have not come to know one another as fellow human beings, as neighbors. And so we hold beliefs about each other, not based on our own experience. We have seen how intentional public policy systematically disadvantaged Black people in housing, in education, benefits, jobs, criminal justice system, voting rights, that the Plessy v. Ferguson decision that declared separate but equal created a system where indeed separate took hold, and where it was not equal, and most often not, white was always superior. And so the roots of today's inequality are deeply embedded. There is so much that we never knew, that we didn't understand about our history, about how we got here. And I think we need to ask ourselves the question, why not? Why did we not know this history? Why did we not learn it? We know that this history of segregation has isolated us one from another because it took place in all aspects of social interaction, especially housing, but hotels, restaurants, theaters, transportation. That Black-white divide by law kept us separate from one another for 100 years. And by not knowing each other on a personal basis, not just one person or another, but as a community of people, there's a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness, particularly on the part of us white people, that we don't really have a meaningful comprehension of what it's like to be Black in America. And if that personal knowledge is missing, what fills the vacuum are stereotypes that flourish. And those stereotypes come from family, from friends, from neighbors, from schools, and the media intensifies those stereotypes with both overt and subliminal messaging. Some of you have heard me say that I took part in a class that the DuPont company offered. I worked for DuPont, This would have been going on 50 years ago, and it was called Developing Effective Black-White Relationships, a pretty benign title. There were 20 white supervisors and managers who were selected for the class. And I confess, when we went, there was some sense of, why am I here? Is it because DuPont thinks that I could develop cross-racial relationships, or because I need remedial training? I was a certain degree of discomfort. And the two facilitators were Black men from San Francisco. And they began the class by acknowledging that we white managers might be feeling some discomfort. Often when the issue of race is raised, certainly back then, even today, there's some sense of, am I guilty? Do I need to feel ashamed? I'm not sure I'm going to like the way this makes me feel. And they began by saying, to be perfectly clear, you can say what you will, you can think what you will about your degree of prejudice or even racism, but the truth is that you cannot have grown up in the United States of America in the 20th century and not be prejudiced. It isn't possible. So it isn't helpful to try to articulate that position. It's important to learn who we are, what we believe, even where it came from, and then ideally, what do we do about it? So I'm going to take a little bit of time and look at how the media has played a role. This is a chart from 2014, and it is a TV news study that was done. And each of those blue and red columns deals with a particular crime. First murder, then theft, then assault. And the blue bar is the percentage of suspects who were arrested for that crime in a 4-year period who were African American. Now, we've learned by our study of the criminal justice system that, I'm sorry, somebody's microphone is on. We've learned from our study of the criminal justice system that Black people tend to be arrested more frequently for crimes. So that being said, 54% of those arrested for murder in that 4-year period were African American. But when looking at media reports about murder, a Black suspect was shown on TV 74% of the time. In the area of theft, 55% of those arrested for theft were African American, but the TV news reflected African American theft suspects 84% of the time. And for assault, it was 49% arrested, 73% shown on TV. And so nobody watching television was paying attention to these numbers or would have even known that they existed. But the result was that the overwhelming images of people charged with these crimes were visibly African American. And that messaging gets absorbed, whether we're conscious of it or not. Here are 2 screens from the same news program on March 23rd, 2015. Early in the broadcast, there was a report that 3 University of Iowa wrestlers had been arrested and burglary charges were pending. Pictures of these fine-looking young men who had been arrested for and charged with burglary. And then a few minutes later in the broadcast, a report that Coralville police had arrested 4 men in a burglary investigation. And there's messaging there as to who are these people? What do they look like? What are they like? What conclusions can we draw about them? Again, They weren't arrayed next to each other. You wouldn't necessarily have thought about it in those terms, but that messaging keeps coming through. And so what comes about as a result of this implicit and explicit messaging is something called implicit bias. And we absorb it automatically, unintentionally, often unconsciously. It's just there. We just take it in. And that's what those two men from San Francisco said. We are bombarded by this messaging, and it takes hold, either with our knowledge or unconsciously. This class I took was pivotal in my education and awareness. The class was 20 white DuPont managers and 2 Black DuPont employees from manufacturing plants in the South. I didn't ask why that's where they came from at the time, but on reflection, I'm thinking there really weren't any Black DuPont employees in Wilmington to participate in the class. And the facilitators explained that their role was to be present. And as the facilitators began sharing with us information about the quote, the way things are, our tendency as white managers would be to say, yeah, but not at DuPont. I understand that that happens places, but not here. And so the role of the 2 Black DuPonters, when appropriate, would be to say, well, actually, yes, at DuPont. And I will never forget the woman from one of the plants who, when we got into some discussion, and someone had said something about DuPont's commitment to equal rights and so forth, and she said, the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan holds its monthly meetings at the DuPont plant in the plant conference room at the invitation of the plant manager. And you stop and think, what would it be like to be a Black employee at that plant, knowing that that is part of the power structure, the way things are. They began the class by saying to the white participants, okay, we want you to list every word that you can think of that describes Black people. We're going to write them on a chart pad. And there was awkward silence. And finally, one brave white person said, exotic. Wrote it down, exotic. Okay, what else? Musical, yeah, musical, okay. Athletic, yep. Rhythm, okay. And there were 8 or 9 words and it petered out. And the facilitator said, oh my gosh, we're so sorry. We didn't give you the correct instructions. We're so sorry. We didn't want you to tell us what you think. We wanted you to tell us what you've heard. And we filled 11 chart pad pages with terms like rapist, murderer, cheat, burglar, lazy, stupid, 11 chart pad pages. And I hung them up on the wall. And then the facilitator said to the 2 Black employees, so what words come to mind to you when you think of white people? And they said entitled, privileged, condescending, in charge, about a chart pad page worth. And I'm sitting there in that room looking at those 11 pages of the most horrific terms and thinking, what must it be like to leave your home in the morning knowing that the people you encounter think those things about you? What burden is that to carry? And as you interact with people, how do you know? It has been said and proven by studies that in our country, not just our country, white people in general are presumed to be competent until they demonstrate that they aren't. And I've seen that happen a time or two. On the other hand, Black people coming into a white organization at some level are generally presumed to be sketchy, maybe not competent, until they demonstrate that they are. And often there is praise and maybe surprise at the capability demonstrated by people who didn't enter the environment that way. There have been significant studies done about job applications where I think CBS News was one organization, but a number of university institutions as well, put together resumes that were identical in terms of education and training and, every aspect of a job applicant's background. The only differentiating factor was the name at the top of the resume. And they were submitted in application for the same job. And one of the applicants was quite clearly John Smith, a white person, and the other Sadiq Muhammad, or clearly a name that is associated with African American. And the rate of callbacks, interviews, job offers were so dramatically different just on the basis of that name before anything was known about the individual. And questions arise, particularly for white people. How many Black professionals do you deal with in your life? Your doctor, your dentist, your attorney, your financial advisor. Do we tend to operate in white circles? A form of segregation, if you will. And you can say, well, yeah, but there aren't nearly as many African American doctors or dentists or financial advisors. And all of that is true, but that segregation continues to hold in the relationships that we have. I'm going to ask you to take a test when we're done, and it is called the implicit bias test. It has been put together by Harvard University. You go to implicit.harvard.edu/implicit, and there are a number of the tests, but select the one on race and then take it. And more than 30 million people have now taken the test, and the results are available. And the results are striking because they help to measure implicit bias, which is certainly not easily quantifiable. And yet this test has been demonstrated to show the degree to which we have absorbed messaging about difference in race and how we see people of another race. So I would be interested for you to take that and see what your reaction to it might be. So how this affects all of us, it requires that each of us take personal responsibility for our beliefs, for our actions, for our words, and especially for us white people, to confront these beliefs when they surface, to acknowledge them as they arise, and they just do. We wish they didn't in many instances. We think they're not there, but indeed, we can't help it. It's how we have been messaged and programmed. And so what's next in all of this? I would say prayer and self-examination are essential steps here. And to the white people in our group, I say we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We don't have all the answers. We don't know what we don't know. Often we're afraid of making a mistake. And so maybe we don't say anything, or we hold back, or we don't take action. But being uncomfortable is okay. In fact, it's necessary. It's growth. If we already know it all, then the work is done. And we don't. And so there is work ahead. And continuing education and dialogue are important parts of our learning together, sharing our thoughts or questions or knowledge, and listening not for response, certainly not for rebuttal, but listening for understanding. When someone describes a situation that they found hurtful, it often happens that the white person will say, "Oh, I'm sure they didn't mean that. You're probably overreacting." It's important to hear what people are saying. And those conversations can be painful and difficult, and they emerge best when they take place through a relationship that exists for another reason, not just to talk about what's it like to be Black, what's it like to be white. And then understanding what needs to be done, making a decision as to what action can I take, what can I do? And then ideally, making a personal commitment to do something to help rectify the discrimination and the wrongs that exist. So the self-examination can be difficult, because so many of our attitudes are just there. They've been there all along. We don't question them. But if you have an opportunity to be in a situation where race is a factor, where there are Black and white people together, observe ourselves in that situation and assess how we feel. Comfortable, uncomfortable, don't need to worry about it. How are we when we're in situations like that? And reflect on that. And then when we have a situation in which race is involved, monitoring our reactions, be self-aware. I had a situation 7 or 8 years ago. My husband Bob and I were in Washington, D.C. with friends for Columbus Day weekend. And we got a phone call from our housekeeper, who came in once a month, and a giant 200-foot tall tree had fallen on our house, and it crushed the roof and the ceiling. She was there when it happened. She escaped injury, but it was terrifying. And we came home, and of course, it was a terrible mess. We contacted the insurance company. Ultimately, they sent out the underwriters, and then the worker people came to repair the damage. And the way the tree had fallen, it had intertwined itself in the decks, and we were very concerned that in removing the tree, they were going to do more harm than had happened when the tree fell. And I was sitting in the living room as all the work was beginning, and I heard this giant crash, and the whole house shook. And I looked out, and I saw that the crew chief was white, and I felt better. So I've been doing this work for flat out ever, and it doesn't matter. There are beliefs, there are thoughts that are there, but when they surface, it's important to say, well, that was stupid. You know better. Had I said something, I would have needed to apologize. but reshaping the automatic response. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, could be a white person or a Black person, but maybe if it's a Black person, the response is a little different. Why would it be different? Reshape those responses. And to do that, it's really helpful to engage a partner. Find somebody that you know well, that you trust, that you would be okay if they said, Sue, that really was not the best of responses that you just said, so that you can have somebody observe you and give feedback on what's appropriate and perhaps what's not. It's hard to see ourselves as others see us, so find a buddy. We know that for education to continue, there are books and videos and articles, wonderful museums. The National Museum for African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. is extraordinary. You can't see it all in a day or 2 days or 3 days. I've been to Montgomery, Alabama, and the Equal Justice Initiative Legacy Museum and Lynching Memorial are powerful experiences. Maybe a group wants to get together and go, and then talk about it, see how the experience has affected each. And then classes and discussion groups. I'll send these out, but I suspect you all probably have some recommended books that you have found useful, and it would be good for us to share those with one another. America's Original Sin by Jim Wallis was one of the very first books that I read when I began doing this work. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson follows 3 families through the Great Migration. It's a beautiful book. And Caste is her more recent book and is a telling assessment of the caste system that exists in the United States and how it relates to similar systems in other countries. For white people, the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo is excellent, as is a brief 22-minute video that she has done that I have probably watched 15 times, and I get something different out of it every time I watch it. There is learning, there is knowledge to be gained. There are some amazing videos. PBS has put out a series called Race, The Power of an Illusion, because there is no genetic basis, no biological basis to racial distinction. But the illusion, the social construct of race has enormous power, as we've seen. And this PBS video helps uncover all of that. More recently, I'm thinking the last 3 years, Jeffrey Robinson has put out a video called Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. It's on Netflix. It's 2 hours. It pretty much covers what we've spent 6 weeks on. And it is an excellent, excellent video to watch with friends and family members, because it generates really meaningful discussion and dialogue. I recommend it highly. Get a group of people together, watch it, talk about it. It's excellent. And 13th, of course, is the documentary by Ava DuVernay that talks about the legacy of the loophole in the 13th Amendment that led to convict leasing and public chain gangs and the mistreatment of prisoners in our criminal justice system even today. There are some excellent articles. One is The History of the Idea of Race. And the Equal Justice Initiative puts out an ongoing series of reports that are beautifully bound and illustrated books, deeply researched. When I first began ordering these from eji.org, they were $4 a piece and free shipping. Now they're $6 and there's a shipping fee. But the data contained in them and the way they're presented is just really outstanding. And they keep putting out more. So I commend that website and that series of reports to you. And in 2014, Ta-Nehisi Coates, the author, wrote an article for the Atlantic magazine. entitled The Case for Reparations. And you can read that even if you don't have a subscription to The Atlantic. So, more dialogue. I'm sorry. Discussion groups, book groups, join one, form one. Suggest one of these books be read by a group that you're part of. Work at developing cross-racial relationships. Most effective when there's a shared project to work on, not to work on race per se, but to work collaboratively together on something that is important to everyone in the group. And again, listen for understanding. And particularly for the white people in this group, speak up. Share what you've learned. And speak up, especially when people express racist comments. I think we have all been in circumstances where that's happened. And I think for many of us, myself included, the tendency has been to be quiet, to not say anything. Well, I'm not going to change their mind, so, or that would make everybody uncomfortable, or I couldn't think of what to say. And then I get home and say, I could have had a V8. So I had a boss once who said, if you're going to have a difficult circumstance, think about what you would do out of the heat of battle before it happens. So either remember something that happened or imagine something that might, and think what you might say. Practice it in front of a mirror. I've done that. That's not my experience. I don't agree. I don't agree with that. Actually, and offer a fact, or I used to think that, but I learned, or I read, I saw, and I found this really informative. You might want to take a look. So think about it and be prepared to respond. Speaking up is so important. We are all in this together. So in addition to personal growth, there is so much work to be done. It can't all be accomplished, and certainly none of us can get engaged in everything. And so my suggestion is pick an issue. Out of all we've learned, out of all we've seen, or out of your own personal experience, what issue touches you, moves you? Is it voting rights, criminal justice, police misconduct, education inequity, affordable housing, environmental justice, reparations? What is it that speaks to your heart? And then join an advocacy group. Seek opportunities to work with other people, ideally across racial lines, and make your voice heard personally in conversations, in organizations, and call your representatives at the local, state, federal level. Express your opinion, express your support or opposition, make your voice heard. And perhaps do some personal reparations. Patronize a Black-owned restaurant or bookstore or shop. Help in an economic system and get to know some folks that you might not otherwise get to meet. There are so many advocacy groups in Delaware working in all of these areas. Many of them, most notably, I think, in your area, the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice is doing powerful, powerful work in a range of areas. Look up the topic, the issue, the question, and there are bound to be advocacy groups involved. And so take that step, make that connection. So what got me off the couch? It was the shootings of largely unarmed Black men by police, by authorities, without consequence. It began in 2012 with the murder of Trayvon Martin, continued with 14-year-old Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Stephon Clark, Botham Jean, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Antoine Rose, sweet Elijah McClain, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tyree Nichols, Breonna Taylor, Sonia Massey. I don't give this class series without adding another name to the list, Sonia Massey's being the most recent. And there have been hundreds and thousands more. And the visuals of these crimes without consequence is what got me going. So the question is, what is it that speaks to each of us? So in closing, you may know Eddie Glaude. He is the head of the African American Studies Department at Princeton University. He's a frequent commentator on MSNBC and other networks, and I love listening to him. He is absolutely straightforward, direct, often says things that are uncomfortable for me, that I don't like, but I acknowledge I need to hear and are likely true. And he's most recently written a book on James Baldwin. And so he's gotten very involved in James Baldwin's life. And he said that at one point, James Baldwin said the question that he got from white people that he hated the most was, what does the Negro want? And his response was, what do you want? You want fairness. You want justice. You want opportunity. You want safety. That's what the Negro wants. Not a handout, not special treatment. What do we want as human beings? So, what is our conception of justice? Should some people be valued more than others because of the color of their skin? Because that's the way it's working. Black people are dying because of racism, because of violence, police action, health inequities, food deserts, poverty, malnutrition, lack of access to health care, stress-related comorbidities, maternal and infant mortality rates. Is that justice? Scientists, social scientists have said that one of the most telling indicators of discrimination is life expectancy. And in October 2018, the Census Bureau created a comprehensive census tract level database covering nearly the entire United States population, with life expectancy as a fundamental indicator of inequality. It is the broadest possible dimension of privilege because so many factors go into life expectancy. The life expectancy for a child born in Centerville, Delaware, exceeds that of a child born in Wilmington near East 12th Street by 18 years. And those census tracts are less than 6 miles apart. And indeed, racism hurts all of us. Our country is at risk. We must act. So begin looking at ourselves, continued education and dialogue, determine what action is needed, what calls to you, and make a personal commitment. And oh, by the way, vote. So as we come to the end of this time, some reflection questions for you. What in this period of time together has had the most significance to you? What inequity or inequity touches you? And thinking ahead, what would be your commitment, your action?